Hi, this will be the first video of the Swords and Sultans channel. It's a channel focused on medieval Islamic history. So we'll be covering a wide variety of topics ranging from the Crusades, the Mamluks, early Muslim expansion in the 7th century, all the way to the Ottoman period. And in addition to this, we'll sometimes go beyond that focus to touch on topics related to medieval European history, Roman history, and much more. But before I get started with today's topic, I'd first like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon just so that you can be kept updated on new videos that will be coming up in the coming weeks. So without any further ado, let's get started with today's topic, which will be on the development of early centers of Muslim resistance to the Crusader States in the early 12th century. Now, as many of you know, towards the end of the 11th century, large armies burst out of Europe in the form of the First Crusade and marched across the breadth of the continent, crossed into Asia Minor, and then made it to the Levant. And there they managed to carve out a series of states stretching from Antioch in the north all the way to the Red Sea in the south. Now, this obviously sent shockwaves across the whole Muslim world because up until that point, there had never been an invasion to the heartlands of the Muslim world to that level of success. So this was something quite unprecedented. And obviously people throughout the cities of the Muslim world were in an uproar, and there was a lot of pressure on the rulers to take a robust response to this new threat. But as we'll see in the early years following the fall of Jerusalem, we don't see much of a significant response. Now, to understand why this might be the case, we have to go back before the First Crusade. So just a few years before the First Crusade was launched, the Seljuk Empire, which at the time had ruled a big chunk of the Middle East, was ruled by Malik Shah, their strongest sultan. And in 1092, he passed away. And following his death, the Seljuk Empire went into civil war. And following that civil war, it would never regain the same level of unity it had prior. So what ended up happening is we had a much more fragmented Seljuk Empire where you still had rulers in the Levant who, at least in name, were loyal to the Seljuk Sultan, but effectively they were a largely autonomous ruler who controlled their own city-states and tended to follow their own interests, their own regional interests. And so when the Crusaders first arrived, you often find that, there was a lot of bickering between the rulers. You had some that didn't trust others, so you didn't really get any kind of coordinated response, which was a large factor behind the success of the First Crusade. And in the years following the fall of Jerusalem in 1099, the Crusaders kept on expanding, and it seemed like there was nothing capable of stopping them until they suffered one of their first major defeats, which was in 1104. So that year, the armies of Antioch, the Principality of Antioch, as well as the County of Edessa, tried to expand their domains further east by taking the city of Haran, which is in modern-day southeastern Turkey. So they marched and besieged that city, but that triggered a response from the Atabeg of Mosul, whose name was Jekarmesh, and he, along with the governor of Mardi and Suqman, marched to the aid of that city. And in the Battle of Haran in 1104, they managed to inflict a fairly decisive defeat against the Crusaders. Now, this for sure ensured that Edessa would really be the maximum east the Crusaders would manage to go. So it sort of set the limits of eastwards expansion, even though they would still expand further in the direction of the south, as we'll see. Now, following that victory, we don't see any significant rollback in Crusader-held territories. It merely halted Crusader expansion, ensured that Haran would remain in Muslim hands, but beyond that, no territorial changes. And that seems to be fairly common to the early years of resistance against the Crusaders. Now, in 1110, something new does happen. Now, the year prior to that, Tripoli, which was nominally under Fatimid control, fell to the hands of the Crusaders, and that triggered a very large outcry, especially from people that were from that city, some of whom went to Baghdad and essentially pleaded before the Seljuk Sultan, the Abbasid Caliph, to take action to prevent this. Or I should say, to take action to strike back against the Crusaders. And that's precisely what happened. In the following year, in 1110, the Seljuk Sultan, for the first time, declared a jihad against the Crusader States. And essentially what that means is he was making it a religious obligation for any Muslim ruler with the ability to take up arms against the Crusader States and to try to roll back their tide. So this was taken up by the governor of Mosul, or I should say the new governor of Mosul, Maudud, who raised an army, and then he first tried to take Edessa itself, and he besieged it that year in 1110, but the siege was unsuccessful. 2 years later, however, he was actually invited by the Armenian population that lived in the city, and they had essentially lived under Crusader rule for a number of years now, and they were quite unhappy with Crusader governance, which they considered to be quite oppressive. So they invited him to come and essentially rescue them, and they offered to provide aid in the siege, which might have taken the form of maybe opening a gate, letting them have access to one of the towers. But unfortunately for the Armenians in Edessa, that did not work, because the Crusaders quickly caught wind of this, and they inflicted a very brutal reprisal against the Armenian population. So with obviously taking back Edessa no longer an option, Maudud had to return back to Mosul. However, 1 year later, Maudud would probably have his crowning military achievement, and this is when he teamed up with the Atabeg of Damascus, Toghtaken, and together they managed to inflict a very decisive defeat against the Crusaders at the Battle of As-Sanabra. However, again, we don't see any territorial changes happening after this, and this is due to a number of factors, which I'll be talking about later on. So one of the last of the early rulers who took up arms against the Crusaders and tried to sort of turn back their tide was Il-Ghazi. Now, Il-Ghazi was the governor of Mardin, which is in the historical region of Jazira, also in modern-day southeastern Turkey. Now, Il-Ghazi was invited in the year 1117 to take possession of Aleppo, which was the chief city of northern Syria. Aleppo, right from the beginning of the crusade, of the First Crusade, was very much at the brunt of Crusader attacks. It was bordered by both the Principality of Antioch as well as the County of Edessa, and it was, the Crusaders made no secret of the fact that they had designs on taking that city. So Al-Ghazi was actually invited by a princess of Aleppo. Her name was Amina Khatun, who, following the death of the previous ruler, she needed to ensure that there was a strong ruler there that can take command of the city and defend it against a Crusader invasion that was sure to come. So in 1117, Al-Ghazi set out for Aleppo. He took control of that city, and he set about consolidating his position in the city. 2 years later, it would seem that Amina's concern was actually quite valid, because a Crusader army from Antioch did indeed march against Aleppo. So Al-Ghazi raised the armies and he marched against them, and they met at the Battle of Sarmada, also known in Latin sources as Ager Sanguinis, which literally means the bloody field. And it was called that because Al-Ghazi managed to not only defeat the army, but essentially destroy it almost entirely. So it was a very decisive victory for Al-Ghazi, and it had a big role in boosting Muslim morale, which for a long time had been quite demoralized by the fall of so many of the cities of the Levant, by the fall of Jerusalem. So this really put some wind behind their sails, and it really highlighted the fact that, yes, the Crusaders were a very formidable opponent. They should be taken seriously, but they could be defeated, and they had been defeated. However, one of the things that the chroniclers remark upon is there's no significant territorial changes. So Al-Ghazi did take back some bordering forts, some bordering towns, but he never, for instance, tried to take back Antioch from the Crusaders. One of the reasons for that, or at least one of the factors that the chroniclers of the period ascribed, was El-Ghazi's drunkenness. So he was known for being a bit of an alcoholic. And after taking back some of these neighboring forts and towns, he actually retires back to Aleppo. And according to some sources, he goes into an extended drunken stupor where he's essentially drunk for over 20 days celebrating his victory. So some chroniclers are fairly harsh in their criticism of El-Ghazi, saying that he squandered an opportunity to take back Antioch. Others, however, say that the means to take back such a major city were not there yet, because he didn't yet control enough manpower, enough resources to enable him to carry out a siege, as well as a protracted war against the combined might of the Crusader States. However, regardless of the reasons, even after that decisive victory, the map more or less remains the same in terms of who holds what territory. So the reason I wanted to talk about these three figures, and of course they're not the only ones that had resisted the Crusaders. The Fatimids, for example, were carrying out raids regularly against the Crusaders, and they managed to retain control of the city of Asqalan on the Palestinian coast, and they actually used it as a base to strike against the Crusaders. However, unlike those different rulers from that were based in the Jazeera region, they never seem to have been able to deal a decisive victory against the Crusaders. And I'll be doing a future video talking about the militaries of the different rulers at the time, and the advantages, disadvantages they had in wars against the Crusaders. But for now, I did want to keep the focus on those three rulers because I find that they're very emblematic of the early Muslim efforts against the Crusader states, especially those that had some degree of success. Now, when we look at those three rulers and we analyze their military efforts against the Crusader states, we do detect some common themes and a thread that links those efforts. So one of them is the localized nature of that early resistance. So rather than being, for example, the Seljuk state as a whole or the Fatimid state as a whole launching major military responses against the Crusaders, much of the early successful resistance was actually carried out by local governors who drew largely upon their own local forces and didn't necessarily have the full military backing of a larger state. So it was very much a local effort. And that also meant that while they could have successful battles, they could take back some neighboring forts and towns. They didn't have the resources required to fully roll back the Crusader states. So that was one factor that was common to those early efforts. Another thing worth noting is the fact that even as you had Muslim rulers fighting back against the Crusaders, and even though sometimes they managed to ally with one another, there was a lot of mutual suspicion between those rulers. So for example, a good example being Tohtakin, the governor of Damascus. Now he did a fair bit of fighting against the Crusaders, but whenever he felt like a neighboring Muslim ruler was becoming too strong, too influential, he was willing to actually ally with the Crusaders to defend his interests. So that was very much part of the environment during that time period. Another commonality we see is in terms of geography. So when we look at where these early Muslim rulers that took up war against the Crusaders were from, or where they were based, we find that most of them were actually from the Jazeera region. And the Jazeera region it's a historical region that essentially corresponds to modern-day northeastern Syria, northwestern Iraq, as well as southeastern Turkey. So the vast majority of the early Muslim rulers that took up the fight against the Crusaders were actually from that region. And there's a number of reasons for that. So one of them could be that they were actually closer to the center of Seljuk power. So whereas the Seljuk Sultan might not be able to exert much influence on his technical governors in the Levant, because the ones in Jazeera were much closer to his center of power, he still had a bit of influence over them and was able to direct them to take the war to the Crusaders. So that could be one reason behind that. Another reason could be that because the Jazeera region was a bit more isolated than the Levant states, they had the ability to focus more on offense as opposed to being largely preoccupied with defense and retaining whatever territories they still had on their hands. So they had a bit more flexibility to take up that offensive initiative. Whatever the reasons, though, what we see from all of this is the military capability to defeat the Crusaders was very much present. The talented commanders were very much there, but for a number of factors that I've discussed, it wasn't achieving any lasting change or a significant rollback to Crusader presence in the region. This would all change with the rise of Zengi. Now, Zengi was a man of iron will who would achieve successes that none of his predecessors achieved, and I'll be talking more about him in future videos. But for now, I want to thank you so much for listening to this video, and please let me know what your thoughts are about this. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, please feel free to share that in the comments section. And I'll see you on the next one.